Hello, my name is Jocelyn Furman, and I'm joined with Dorothy Nguyen. We are 2 out of the 7 practicum undergraduates studying the assessment of cumulative lead exposure in Los Angeles children. We are sponsored by Dr. Jennifer J. and supported by Naomi Adams. Our client is Early Head Start, Allies for Every Child.
So why even bother studying lead? As a potent neurotoxin, it interferes with brain development, which can cause lower IQ and underperformance in school. This is particularly dangerous when we consider that 90% of brain mass is already developed by age 5. That means that developmental issues in this critical window does have the potential to cause problems in school and learning and behavior later on. The brunt of this burden is usually disproportionately put on low-income communities of color, and we've seen this countless times. For example, in the 90s, Hopkins did a lead abatement study on 108 Black families, and they neglected to tell them that they had elevated levels of lead in their blood and in paint. We can see the Exide battery plant today causing lead contamination problems for working class Latinx people here in Los Angeles. Lead contamination is a potent, widespread problem because it's been used in like gas, pipes, and paint. So it's basically everywhere in the environment, and it has a lot of ways of getting into the body. What we're going to study exactly is ingestion through water and hand to mouth and dermal exposure through soil and dust. With that, our research questions are: how can we engage underserved communities in collecting home samples of soil, dust, water, and food, which from this point on will just be referred to as multimedia samples? How do we get those multimedia samples in a COVID-safe, CDC-compliant way? How can we quantify them to then create a total exposure calculation? And can this serve as a foundation for remediation? Our goals are to quantify elements of average daily dose based on these home samples, and secondly, to identify risk factors using survey responses from family participants, GIS analysis, and seeing what existing literature has to say on risk factors like race, ethnicity, and income.
For a study, we recruited, had surveys sent out, which then we would use to sample and then have risk index created to then create science communication for our families. From our surveys, the notable results are divided between demographics and potential routes of lead. Important findings under the demographics section are shown here. We found all of the family participants belong to the Latinx or Hispanic ethnic group. The majority of the children participating in our study are 4 years or younger. The reporters of the survey hold diverse levels of education, with the majority being unemployed, which is shown in the Table 1 and Chart 1. For potential exposure routes, we found notable results here, which are shown. We drew from the survey the source of water in the homes. The majority of homes had drank from bottled water. We also found that 4 out of the 5 families that participated have no filtered water sources in their home. We also asked to report any exposure pathways, for instance, schools attended and parks visited, to then we will create and sample at these locations, and to help us communicate more on where their exposure lies. One resource we created from this was our risk index, which is shown here, and we're going to break it down by using the example of Culver City. Using a point system, we have sections here, so I will be walking you through how we created the lead exposure risk for Culver City. For the housing age, points were given for housing built between 1950 and 1980. Culver City was granted 1 point. 1 point was given for historical railroad proximity to the extent of being within 150 meters and greater. 2 points were given to Culver City here. Points were given based off extent of proximity for freeways. Culver City was granted 0. For airfields, points were given based on the degree of proximity to airfields, airports. Culver City was granted 0. 1 point was given for census blocks being over 50% Black populations. Culver City was granted 0. For Latinx populations, Culver City was granted 0. This is for census blocks being over 50% Latinx. 1 point was given for the census block being over county poverty line. Culver City was granted 0. 1 point was given if the census block fell within Excite exclusion zone. Culver City was granted 0. Total risk index is 3, which means that Culver City has a low lead exposure risk.
Because we are working with families and daycares, we thought that a website would be a palatable and accessible way to communicate our findings. So on it, community members can find neighborhood profiles for where they live, informational resources, as well as the data that we've gotten through our study, available in both English and Spanish. As we wrap up our project, we can reflect on some of the challenges that we faced, a big one being COVID-19. That did interfere with family and client ability to actively participate. And our biggest initial challenge was on if we were even going to get reliable samples, if we ourselves would not be able to carry out the collection protocol personally. Next, data that is reliable is few and far in between, especially for water fountains in schools, their lead levels, as well as those in blood. And the equipment used in the laboratory to quantify these samples is difficult to use and troubleshoot. Lastly, what we've taken away from this is that predictable things like historic neglect of lead remediation that we've been knowing about and unpredictable things like pandemics interplay with each other to affect communities. And we need to be cognizant of that in our outreach and our research. With this project being a preliminary design on risk assessment in a home, despite these challenges, we're glad that we were able to do some risk assessment as well as create a risk index. And we look forward to applying what we've learned to refining this process and making it more descriptive and conclusive. And with that, we are done with our presentation. We look forward to any questions that you have, so please ask away.